Welcome, friends. It's good to see you. We're in study number 32 in the Gospel of Mark. I've entitled this series, The Divine Invasion. We are in Mark chapter 13 today. We're going to take all 37 verses today. I think they need treatment as a whole so you can get the bigger picture. In some cases, I think there might be a feeling that we're not dealing with a lot of the details in the chapter maybe as well as we could, and I will admit that right up front. But I will, as we're going through this, give you kind of my view of some of the more interesting things that are said. And I'm not going to be quite as dogmatic about Mark chapter 13 because of all the prophecy. The reason that I'm afraid to be a little dogmatic about this, to be dogmatic at all, is because prophecies sometimes have more than one fulfillment. There might be one that's partial fulfillment, and then there'll be a double prophecy, and then it'll have a complete fulfillment. And that is the nature of prophecies in the Old Testament, and it is the nature of prophecies in the New Testament writings as well. And here we are in Mark chapter 13, where Jesus gives his a prophecy on the end of time and also on the destruction of Jerusalem. Interestingly, this is the longest sermon, if you want to call it sermon, or continuous teaching of anything else that's done in the Gospel of Mark. Now, if let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Mark is the first of the Gospels, and I think we have probably good reason to believe that, then it's important that when you look at Mark, you look at it as an individual gospel. You don't go shopping around Matthew, Luke, and John for explanations on Mark. And what's interesting is you really need to deal with Mark as a whole unto itself, because it probably was the first of the gospel. So the longest teaching of Jesus in the book of Mark deals with the end of Jerusalem and the end of time. And that fascinates me. And the sermon begins in verse 5 as an answer to a question about a statement Jesus made about the temple. So let's get right into it. Let's start with verse 1. I'm going to read through verse 4, and then we're going to move quickly, as I don't want to go much over 30 minutes on this, although you could go an hour. I'm not going to do that to you. Starting at verse 1, chapter 13, Mark. As Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." "Do you see all these great buildings?" replied Jesus. "Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they are all about to be fulfilled?" Now, someone who follows Jesus is awed by the moment. We don't know. It just says in verse 1 that one of his disciples said this. I'm not certain whether it's one of the 12 disciples or one of the 70 or the 120. I really don't know. It just says one of the followers of Jesus is awed by the moment. Here they are at Passover in Jerusalem near this spectacular structure called the temple. And it's just probably a moment of true reverence and awe. I'm not saying that there was any intention here at all to get Jesus to say something that was bad. The magnificence of the temple is spoken of by historians. Historians that I have read record that at that period of time, around 30 AD, that the light stones that were used to build the temple were quite reflective, so that at certain times of the day, and probably this time of day, the temple on the mount looked like a star, that it shone with the reflected beauty and brightness of the sun. It certainly would have been stunning to look at, and it's probably natural that someone would just be open-mouthed and say, "Wow, look at these stones, well, it's magnificent." And we learn from Jesus that God does not look on the appearance of things. He looks on the heart. He looks deeper. In this case, he looks into the future. He sees Israel's unbelief with reference to Jesus himself as the Messiah. And Jesus is blunt. This spectacular building made of massive stones that shines like a star on a mountain is going to be torn apart, stone from stone, and there will not be left one stone upon another. That statement must have stunned the apostles, so much so that perhaps they waited for the right moment to ask exactly what he meant by that, because this was truly incredible. And then Jesus begins this lengthy prophecy about what's going to happen. In verse 5 of chapter 13, Jesus said to them, watch out that no one deceives you. Watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name claiming, I am he, and will deceive many. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places and famines, and these are the beginning of birth pains. Wars, rumors of wars. Have you heard those statements before? Of course you have. We've all heard them. It's a very common, often used passage from the New Testament, and it's from Mark's passage in chapter 13. Jesus speaking of wars, rumors of wars. Nation will rise up against nation, kingdom against kingdom. And then he says, but it's not time yet for the coming. It says these are the beginning of birth pains. Interesting word usage there to speak of these events, these cataclysmic earthly events, as labor pains. Reminds me of something that the Apostle Paul said in Romans 8 about how the world was to be reformed, destroyed, and then recreated. In Romans 8, verse 21, he speaks of the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves groan as in the pains of childbirth, he's saying, eagerly groaning inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. Note the idea of labor pains in connection with the recreation of all creation. The world as we know it is enslaved to decay. Everything gets old, wears out, and dies eventually. Then he speaks of the whole creation groaning as in the pangs or pains of childbirth. The earth itself, in fact, all the creation aches and writhes like a woman in labor as God begins to make everything new. The divine invasion of Jesus Christ that began with his arrival in Bethlehem will end with the restoration of all things, and that has not happened yet. But destruction comes first in the form of natural disasters, earthquakes, drought, and famine, and man-made disasters. Kingdom rises against kingdom, nation rises against nation. Now, some say today that the Lord's coming is imminent because we see all of those things now. Kingdoms rising against kingdoms, nations against nations, and we have earthquakes and famines and droughts and cataclysms and volcanoes. I will say this, people wrote about such things when the World Trade Center collapsed 20 years ago. World War I and World War II literature is spotted frequently with religious sermons and articles that spoke of the end of time coming. The Civil War in America was also spoken of as the end of time. The beginning of labor pains, as Paul might put it, or as Jesus put it in Mark 13. But then Jesus adds, but the time is not yet. So let's continue. Verse 9 of Mark 13. You must be on your guard. You'll be handed over to the local councils and flogged in the synagogues. On account of me, you will stand before governors and kings as witnesses to them. And the gospel must first be preached to all nations. Whenever you are arrested and brought to trial, do not worry beforehand about what to say. Just say whatever is given you at the time, for it is not you speaking, but the Holy Spirit. Brother will betray brother to death, and father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. Everyone will hate you because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. Jesus is referencing that the apostles and first century disciples would themselves suffer for the gospel. They would stand before governors and kings and be witnesses of Christ. The gospel would, in fact, be preached to all nations. Has that happened yet? Colossians chapter 1, verse 6 seems to suggest that this might have already happened in the first century. In Colossians 1, verse 6, it says that in the same way the gospel is bearing fruit and growing throughout the whole world. Speaking of the whole world there, Paul writes in Colossians 1, 6, did Paul mean that the gospel had been preached to the whole world? It sounds like it to every human being. I don't know. I don't know. It sounds like the whole world had been reached, all the nations. Now, I want you to note how cautiously I'm treading here. I have seen several generations come and go and predict the Lord's coming with that generation. I'm hesitant to say with certainty that I understand everything about this prophecy, nor do I understand when exactly Christ will bring an end to life on earth as we know it now and bring imperishable life to an earth that now has nothing but perishing. I'm saying with some certainty that these words in verses 9 through 13, which I just read to you, he's speaking primarily to his disciples. He says, the Spirit will give you what to say when you stand before kings and governors. You don't have to worry about what to say. He said families would be torn apart, parents against their children, children against their parents, that children would betray them to death, their parents to death. One of the things that I've heard from Christians in Afghanistan and other Middle Eastern nations, they often keep their faith a secret from their own families because they're confident that they would be betrayed to the authorities by their own children or by their own parents if they confess their faith in Jesus Christ, because that's just how dangerous the situation is in Islamic families. In verse 13, he says, the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And I will say that that is something for all time, that we need bold, courageous, surrendering to Christ, faith-filled people who are humble and surrendered, who will stand fast no matter what happens as far as persecutions are concerned. And if it's the time of the end, wonderful. Our suffering will be short. If it's not the time of the end, then we shall persevere and we shall stand firm to the end. Let's keep going with what Jesus said in Mark 13, start at verse 14. When you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it does not belong, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one in the housetop go down or enter the house to take anything out. Let no one in their field go back to get their cloak, and how dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that this doesn't happen, will not take place in winter, because those will be days of distress unequaled from the beginning, when God created the world, until now, and never to be equaled again. If the Lord had not cut short those days, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, whom he has chosen, he shortened them. At that time, if anyone says to you, look, here's the Messiah, or look, there he is, do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. So be on your guard. I've told you everything ahead of time. But in those days, following that distress, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. And at that time, people will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And he will send his angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heavens. I think it's possible that Jesus is actually talking about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem here and foreshadowing the ultimate return of Jesus Christ to the earth to gather all the saints from heavens and earth for deliverance. I want to look again at some of the things that will happen. In verse 14, it says, an abomination that causes desolation will stand. An idol, a concentration of evil powers at work in the world. Is that what this abomination of desolation is in verse 14? Or is it the destruction of the temple itself in AD 70? I think that's possible. Those are all possibilities. In verses 15 through 19, you have a description of wartime refugees seeking shelter and safety. As I was reading this passage, I was thinking about the now completed evacuation from Afghanistan. And it was saying, hide in the mountains, go to the housetop. In other words, people would hide on rooftops. Don't let anybody go back to their house to get anything. Don't let anyone go back to the field to get their cloaks. And how dreadful it would be if it was in wintertime for pregnant women to have to flee as refugees. It does sound like some kind of war, or at least some sense of imminent threat to humans on the earth, that they would take cover like that. Distress that Jesus says is like the world has never known before. Josephus, the Jewish historian of which I make often reference to, who himself was in Jerusalem during the siege of the city by the Roman general Titus. He wrote of the horrors of the siege. And I will just tell you that there was no food, there was no water. The food shortages were so horrible that women were consuming their own children. The corpses of bodies were everywhere. It was a bloodbath in Jerusalem as a result of this long siege. It was a time of unique suffering and heartbreak for the Lord God Almighty too, because these were his people with whom he'd made a covenant, and they had broken that covenant by rejecting Messiah. I think it's possible you could say that the destruction of Jerusalem was the low point in cosmic history, a heartbreaking event for the God of heaven who loved Israel, but whom Israel rejected him. Jesus wept over the city of Jerusalem, if you remember. He stated that he would have gathered them safely like a mother hen gathers chicks under his wings. But he emphasized, they would not come. A few Jews did survive the Jerusalem siege, but the nation really has never been the same since. Israel has never ascended to greatness. And many, many Christians did escape based on this prophecy. I believe this book of Mark was written before Jerusalem was destroyed, which means that that these words of Jesus were responsible for the exodus of many Christians from the city of Jerusalem before the fall. And it's said by some historians that very few, if any, Christians perished when the Romans besieged the city. So that's a word of encouragement, isn't it? That God saved his people. God's mercy was tempered by his judgment was tempered by mercy. It says that if he'd allowed this to go on, more people would have died. There would have been more suffering. Jesus warned of false messiahs, false prophets, coming with lying signs and wonders to deceive even the elect, so that even Christians would be fooled. These are cosmic powers of darkness, much like the Egyptian magicians that did their tricks in the power of Satan. And then Jesus would be looking ahead, not only speaking of the destruction of Jerusalem, but also looking ahead. I don't know how verses 24 and 25 can refer to anything that has to do with the destruction of Jerusalem. I think you could make an argument that said, well, this is a sign of the cosmic collapse of a holy city, of the city of the creator of the heavens and the earth. and that the stars fell, and the moon turned to blood, and the sun was darkened. I think you could argue that this is apocalyptic language, highly evocative, provocative, picturesque language to describe what was going in the heavenly places, that the world turned dark when Jerusalem fell, much like the world turned dark when Jesus died. But it does seem to fit better with the idea that one day this is going to literally happen, that the sun will be darkened, we won't see the moon, stars will fall from the sky, and heavenly bodies will be shaken, that everything will change. Not only the cosmic forces of evil, but astronomical events in the heavens will occur as well. And at that time, people will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory, according to verse 26. That seems to indicate the end of time, and that he's going to send his angels to gather all the elect. Now let's go to verse 28. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see these things happening, you know that it is near, right at the door. What's near? The destruction. The destruction of Jerusalem, and then in the shadows, the ultimate destruction and renewal of all things. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. I used to put a firm stake right here and say that everything that Jesus said before this is referring to that generation of people because of what he said in verse 30, that I tell you this generation will not pass away until all these things have happened. I'm not so sure anymore that that's what Jesus meant because of the difficulty in interpreting verses 24 and 25 with the heavenly bodies falling from the sky, the sun being darkened, and gathering the elect from the four winds from the ends of the earth. That has not happened yet. That has not happened yet. And so I have my doubts about, at least I don't think it's happened yet, that I have my doubts about this referencing the everything coming before this as having been going to happen in their lifetime. Although I think he had in mind the destruction of Jerusalem when he said that. And heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Isn't that an interesting way to conclude that particular thought in verse 31, where he's just spoken of the destruction of Jerusalem, and then he immediately pivots. It seems he pivots. He said, heaven and earth will pass away. They're going to die. They're going to go away. But my words, in other words, my promises, will never pass away. Let's keep going and finish the chapter. Verse 32, but about that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard, be alert. You do not know when that time will come. I think here he's speaking very clearly about the end of time. It's like a man going away. He leaves his house and puts his servants in charge, each with their assigned task, and tells the one at the door to keep watch. Therefore, keep watch, because you don't know when the owner of the house will come back, whether in the evening or at midnight, or when the rooster crows or at dawn. If he comes suddenly, do not let him find you sleeping. What I say to you, I say to everyone, watch. The conclusion of the matter is we don't know the date. I think the destruction of the world comes into view here, but he still could be referencing their need to be ready so that they're not caught in Jerusalem before the destruction of the city. You need to be watching and listening. It's said that prophets within the church were prophesying that the end of Jerusalem was near and that most Christians were able to escape, as I mentioned earlier, but that he did so with the words of prophets who were in the churches at that time in Jerusalem. So be alert, don't get lax and go to sleep. He said, watch. So what's the upshot of all this prophecy? I mean, there's a lot of unanswered questions. I'm not here to answer all of those questions. I don't think I can. I think that we're probably dealing with a double prophecy, which has to do with the destruction of Jerusalem and the ultimate return of Jesus, which is a central doctrine in the New Testament, that Jesus is coming back. And I don't think we talk about the second coming like we should. And I'm guilty too. If you consider that this is the longest continuous teaching about one topic in any part of the Gospel of Mark, the coming of the Lord, then it would seem to be very important. Perhaps in that moment of time, he was talking about how they needed to get ready for the coming of Rome, for the destruction of Jerusalem. But for us who are secondary readers, it does appear to me to say we need to be watching, not for the destruction of Jerusalem, but for the return of Jesus Christ, when he's going to come and everybody's going to see him. It's a central teaching of Jesus Christ that he's returning. It was a central teaching of the apostles that Jesus is returning. It was a central teaching of the early church right after the Bible was written. It's believed by many Bible scholars that early Christians believed that the coming of the Lord to redeem all and take them to heaven was imminent in that generation because of what Jesus had said. But Jesus could come at any time, any day. Every generation has said the Lord is coming in their generation. But one day, there's going to be a generation of people, and it might be this one, who predicts the coming of the Lord in that generation. And they're going to be right someday, if not already. I don't know. Jesus said he's not saying. In fact, at this time he said this. He didn't know. Not even the Son, not the angels in heaven know what the Lord God, the creator of heavens and earth, has planned. When I was younger, I thought about the second coming a lot. I was raised in church, and of course you can get your imagination is quite lively when you're 8, 9, 10 years old. And when I was a kid in elementary school, the idea of the second coming just enraptured me. It was so real to me that if there was a test coming up or some difficult challenge that I was to face within a few days, I would always wonder if the Lord's coming was going to come before that day. If I was going to be rescued from my test. Not exactly the most productive way to think about the coming of Jesus Christ. But consider this. Christ is coming. It may be tonight, and the question is, are you ready? Have you been watching for his coming? Are you hoping for more time to make things right? Maybe to apologize to a neighbor, or to repent of a sin, or to forgive someone who has wronged you. And Jesus says, I've warned you ahead of time of what's going to happen. The only thing I haven't told you is when. It will happen. Get ready and watch and make preparation. I don't say this to frighten anybody. Death is a certainty, too, to consider. None of us knows when that day will be. And for us, the Lord will effectively have come when we die, as we will then wait for the resurrection of the dead, and we'll be with Christ in heaven. But no matter how hopeless things look today, no matter how bad things look today, in the news, in the church, with COVID, with Afghanistan, with whatever is distressing you, things are never hopeless, because the creator of heavens and earth has prepared us for a day, a new day, when Christ will come and the world will be made completely new. And as Peter wrote, it will be a place where righteousness and justice dwells. So pray and be ready. I appreciate you joining me today. Hope to see you next time.